The little boy's fingers closed on the frayed edge of Marco Reyes' leather jacket like it was a lifeline, and for a breath-stripped second, the courthouse fell away. Wood-paneled benches, the whisper of reporters, the flash of a camera, until all that mattered was the smell of gasoline and rain, the rough warmth of knuckles that had fought more than men, and the soft, shocked laugh that tore the hush when the girl followed. They didn't look at the men in suits or the marshal with his badge. They didn't look at the judge who had called this place justice. They ran. Marco, knuckle, stiffened, a mountain of tattoos and muscle, and in that instant something in the room cracked. Fear warred with a tenderness no law book addressed. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The judge's gavel hovered like a held breath. Judge Elena Morales' face was a slate she kept carefully sculpted. No tremor in the jaw, no softening in the eyes. But the sight of the children bolting toward a man whose patch declared rules beyond the court's reach made the slate crack in a hairline she did not know she had. The boy, 6, with a mop of dark hair and a missing front tooth, laughed without reservation. The girl, 4, clung to Marco's forearm as if had always been hers, and his hand settled on her head with such familiarity the courtroom swallowed it and readied to judge. "Mr. Reyes," Elena said, voice controlled like a rope, "you are late." Marco's rain-streaked hair stuck to his cheek. His jacket smelled of the road and a diner syrup Mia kept on the counter. He had that look, dangerous, worn, but his face softened when he glanced down at the children. He crouched because he had ordinary bones too. "Your Honor," he said, words gravel and oil. "Sorry, traffic." There was a chorus of reporters leaning forward as if to catch the way he said sorry. The county prosecutor's eyes were knives. A TV light burned his profile into an icon of menace. The marshal shifted his weight, hand drifting near a holster. But no one let the small hands go. The Niña pressed her face to his chest and sniffed, the sound a small animal. Mia Santos stood in the witness room doorway, hands white-knuckled on the folder that contained the affidavits, the bruise photos, the list of calls to shelters. Her mouth forgot how to form words the moment her children found refuge in someone the news channels had defined as calamity. She had dressed clean, hair tied back. She'd rehearsed the cold steel of victimhood the court demanded. Instead, she watched her children choose an outlaw over a system whose vocabulary for her had been suspicion, exhaustion, and endless forms. Heat pooled behind her ribs, shame and an odd fierce relief braided there. "You can't just," murmured the prosecutor, the syllables more accusation than sentence. "They're my responsibility," Marco said, voice low enough that only the people perilously interested leaned in to catch it. They were scared. Elena's gaze hardened. Courtroom cameras loved spectacle. This was worse. Intimacy. She had made a career of parsing messy lives into tidy rulings. She believed in law as a scalpel, neat and necessary. But the law couldn't be a scalpel if it didn't heal the wound it opened. The idea that 2 small children would run past sworn officers and clamor to a man with lightning bolt scars across his knuckles forced her to remember the nights she'd spent knitting bandages for a grief no one sanctioned, an orphaned niece she had buried 16 years ago when the system failed to see the child's small face. "You can't," murmured the prosecutor, the syllables more accusation than sentence. "They're my responsibility," Marco said, voice low enough that only the people perilously interested leaned in to catch it. They were scared. Elena's gaze hardened. Courtroom cameras loved spectacle. This was worse. Intimacy. She had made a career of parsing messy lives into tidy rulings. She believed in law as a scalpel, neat and necessary. But the law couldn't be a scalpel if it didn't heal the wound it opened. The idea that two small children would run past sworn officers and clamor to a man with lightning bolt scars across his knuckles forced her to remember the nights she'd spent knitting bandages for a grief no one sanctioned. An orphaned niece she had buried 16 years ago when the system failed to see the child's small face. She had sworn then that she would never let bureaucracy be a judge over the human need in front of her. The memory made her throat sandpaper. "State the relationship," she said finally. Her voice steadied the room, because every voice in there needed to hear order, even if their ears knew the irony. Marco's jaw ticked. The patch on his back read Iron Crescent, and below it, in the worn curve of cloth, the words held an entire country of rumor. "None, Your Honor," he said. "Not by blood, but I look after them when I can." Murmurs like wind through chain link. The public defender squinted at Marco, evaluating a man she'd heard about in stories that conflated hero and monster. The marshal's jaw clenched. Mia's palms went slick. "Mrs. Santos," Elena turned, the pronoun a lever. "Why did your children leave the witness room?" Mia's voice came out small and reasonable. "They were scared. They wanted water. There's a vending machine." She had a rehearsed line about frightened children looking for familiar comforts and how the defendant's presence, how Marcos was in the hallway. She had not rehearsed the way her throat couldn't explain that the children called him Uncle Knuckle because the boy had thought his knuckles were shaped like soft mountains you could climb. She hadn't rehearsed admitting that she had let Marco wrap her kids in a blanket once when she had no money for heating and he had left her warmed coins in the pocket of her apron. Those moments didn't have legal names. "Why did you seek the Iron Crescent?" Elena asked, watching Mia as if she might be a text to be deciphered. This was the fulcrum. It was one thing for a notorious club to offer shelter. It was another for a mother to turn to them because the shelter system denied her. The courthouse's bright fluorescent lights could not sanitize the way the law smelled of contradiction. Mia's breath broke. "Because," she started, and the answer came out like prayer. "Because I called the shelter, and they said beds were full." "Because when I went to the precinct, they wanted to arrest me for disorderly conduct when I wouldn't let him hit me. And when I filed for a restraining order, the clerk told me to be sure you were telling the truth. She stopped, because finally the court, the place meant to be impartial, felt like a question that required her whole life to answer. I was desperate. Desperation was a currency Elena knew well. She had spent years shaping law to shelter when she could, but the courthouse she ran had no capacity for the kinds of backdoor protections a club could offer. The Iron Crescent's code did not appear on any docket. They offered no forms, no receipts, only iron loyalty and a capacity for violence that made headlines. The thought of that code doing the work of the welfare state made Elena's stomach turn. But the sight of the children clinging to a man who could be called violent but meant safety to them left her with a legal problem and a moral ache. "Order," she said, because she needed the sound of it. Her gavel fell like a stone into moving water. For now, the children will remain in the court's custody. Neither Mr. Reyes nor anyone from his club may approach them within the courthouse. Mrs. Santos, you will remain in the building until this hearing is concluded. Marco's laugh was a dry thing. "Your Honor," he said, rising, "with respect, they won't stay here. They will bolt again, or they'll be taken somewhere they won't want to be. You can't force small kids to sit through what you're about to put them through." "Children's services will be notified," Elena shot back. "Protocol will be followed." "And protocol," Marco said, voice edged, "doesn't always mean they're safe." The courtroom's hum escalated. Someone took a photograph that burned like a pinprick in the corner of Elena's eye. She imagined the headline, "Judge orders custody while infamed biker watches." She imagined the press conferences, the op-eds that would sharpen knives of public opinion. She thought of the marshal's worry, the prosecutor's appetite for scandal. And she thought of the two small bodies that had just chosen him when the system had not. "You will remain in the hall, Mr. Reyes," she said. "You will not touch—" The girl's hand clenched at his jacket as if to anchor him. Marco's gaze flicked to Elena, unblinking. "If I can't be near them, I'll go where I can watch the building. I swear it on the crescent." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. On what grounds would the court accept such an arrangement? Elena felt the old lawwoman in her recoil at the notion of bargains made in the shadows. But something else, maybe stubborn memory, maybe a soft place she had not named, rose up. How often did the law have to bend for the sake of children? How often did she have to weigh the letter against the life it endangered? "Marshal, you will ensure Mr. Reyes remains outside the secured perimeter but within sight. No contact within the building until the hearing concludes." "If he violates that order, he will be held in contempt." "Yes, Your Honor," the marshal said, though his jaw remained hard as a lock. "He did not like orders. If he violates that order, he will be held in contempt." "Yes, Your Honor," the marshal said, though his jaw remained hard as a lock. He did not like orders that invited loopholes. He was a man of badges and borders. The agreement was a thin raft over a churning river. It bought time, but not safety. As the day lengthened and the photographers clustered like piranhas, Elena watched the way Marco stood outside the courthouse doors. One boot rested on the step as if the pavement belonged to him and not a system that had decided he didn't. He smoked like someone marking time. Every so often, the children peeked from behind an officer's hip, and his face softened in ways Elena had not seen on any man she had sentenced. She thought of the kids' laughter, the way it had broken the room's dignity. She thought of her niece's small, pale hands, and the absurd cruelty of systems that made choices between liabilities. Inside, Mia sat with a folder of bruises and a stomach full of knots. She had asked for protection and been met with procedures. She had never wanted the iron crescent to be her safety net. She had wanted the law's net to unfurl. But law was a muscle that atrophied without constant use, and courts were indifferent to the muscles of ordinary survival. The kid's choice to run to Marco was a rebuke to the entire edifice of that indifference, an accusation that screamed louder than any headline. When the court recessed, the prosecutor took his leave with a smirk that smelled of victory. The public defender murmured options that sounded like a chess game. Reporters swarmed the street where Marco leaned against his bike, the engine purring like a captive animal. Mia approached him when no one noticed, fingers twisting in her apron string like a woman with nothing left to lose. "Thank you," she said, voice tight. It was not a plea, it was a confession. Marco turned, and the strange gravity of his smile made something in Mia yield. He had rough hands that smelled of oil, but his eyes were a map of long roads. "They'll be all right," he said. "I won't let anyone take them where they'd be scared." She swallowed. "You could get arrested." He shrugged, the motion simple. "They'd have to come for me first." The difficult dilemma bloomed then, ugly and inevitable. A judge asked by the law to protect two small lives, a mother who had only houses of shame behind her, and a man defined by the ferocity of his love for people he did not own. The courthouse had to decide whether to treat a patch as a threat or, against all precedent, to acknowledge that protection did not always wear a badge. Elena watched the exchange and felt the scales of justice wobble. Between the cafe coffee stain on Mia's folder and Marco's ink-black knuckles, there lay a world too complex for the press to digest in a headline, and a choice she could make that would change more than one life. Outside, the sky turned hard and gray, a weather that tasted like a foreshadowing. The iron crescent's colors flapped in the wind on a jacket hooked over a chair inside Marco's bike. Inside the city, rival clubs drifted like sharks smelling blood in a pool. When the hearing reconvened, the courtroom buzzed with the knowledge that whatever ruling Elena made would be met by people who believed themselves rightful arbiters. The law, the club, and those in the margins who found safety in places they did not expect to explain. Elena tapped her gavel. The day had already decided it would not be simple. She folded the fragile tissue of law over something messy and human, and knew, with a clarity that made her hands tremble, that whichever way she ruled, by protocol or by mercy, there would be consequences whose ripples she could not fully imagine. The marshal's watchful glare could not follow every heartbeat. Outside, the sun's low knife angled off chrome and made Marco's bike look like something holy. Inside, the courtroom smelled of bleach and human decisions. Elena felt the weight of both worlds pressing against her sternum. She had tried all morning to keep the two apart, to treat the Iron Crescent as a public safety risk and the mother as a person under the law's care, but the sight of the children in his arms made her realize that life rarely folded to statutes in neat creases. It folded, she thought, around people. When the hearing resumed, the gallery had filled with an audience that wanted to weigh in on what kind of world the law should make. There were town council members who had been uneasy about the club for years, families that had experienced the Crescent as salvation, and a cluster of younger men in rival colors whose faces held hunger for provocation. The prosecutor, Carter Winthrop, carried a leather binder like a talisman and wore the sort of expression that preferred conviction to nuance. He wanted to make Marco an example. Spectacle, after all, was easier to win. "Mrs. Santos," he said, as if they were returning to a script, "you are accusing your ex of domestic violence. Why did you not pursue police protection sooner?" Mia's palms were still damp. The question was a serrated one, innocuous in tone, but designed to make her stumble. She had rehearsed answers for what the paper called procedural missteps, like a litany. She had imagined the public defender as her shield. But in this room, her children were the true evidence, and they clung to a man whose hands had been trained in other kinds of justice. "I called," she said. "They told me to come in the morning. They said—" Her voice snagged on a memory of a desk sergeant who had flicked through a file and told her cases like stories are expensive. She swallowed. "Sometimes you can't wait until morning." "Why did you reach out to Mr. Reyes specifically?" Carter pressed. He was the kind of prosecutor who believed motives could be parsed into neat categories: negligence, collusion, manipulation. He wanted to make Marco an example. Spectacle, after all, was easier to win. "Mrs. Santos," he said, as if they were returning to a script, "you are accusing your ex of domestic violence. Why did you not pursue police protection sooner?" Mia's palms were still damp. The question was a serrated one, innocuous in tone, but designed to make her stumble. She had rehearsed answers for what the paper called procedural missteps, like a litany. She had imagined the public defender as her shield. But in this room, her children were the true evidence, and they clung to a man whose hands had been trained in other kinds of justice. "I called," she said. "They told me to come in the morning. They said—" Her voice snagged on a memory of a desk sergeant who had flicked through a file and told her cases like stories are expensive. She swallowed. "Sometimes you can't wait until morning." "Why did you reach out to Mr. Reyes specifically?" Carter pressed. He was the kind of prosecutor who believed motives could be parsed into neat categories: negligence, collusion, manipulation. He looked at Marco as if the man might confess that very motive and hand him a scapegoat's rope. Mia looked briefly to Marco. He had not come to court as a showman. His silence told 1,000 small truths. "He helped us. He gave me a place for the night once. He kept the kids while I worked." She felt silly naming banal acts of humanity as if they were evidence. Folded blankets, warm coffee, a whispered promise not to come back until the sun. "I didn't want their father to take them. I thought—" Her words faltered and then steadied. "I thought if they knew someone would be there for them, they'd be safe." Carter smoothed his expression into a predatory calm. So, you allowed them to run from a secured room to seek out an individual with no legal authority to care for them? Mia snapped, the retort coming like a cracked shield. Her anger surprised her. It tasted of guilt and of the rawness of being judged by people who had never had to choose survival on the fly. Yes, to care for them. Is that a crime in your book? The gallery muttered. Elena watched the exchange with a hardening in her throat. Care was not a legal term, it was a life term. The law was a net stitched from concepts. Life used whatever rope was within reach. The prosecutor smelled of precedent and moral show, and his next move was to paint Marco as a danger. It was the kind of story that would please the news cycles. Danger, drama, a judge who took a hard line. He was good at turning complexity into theater. Mr. Reyes, Elena said, leaning forward, you say you look after them. Describe what you mean by that. Marco's hands, calloused, inked, folded in front of him like a boy's. I make sure they're not hungry. I take them to the diner, Mia's place, get 'em milkshakes. I give 'em blankets. I keep an eye when they're scared. I don't pretend I'm family. I don't want to be. No legal guardianship, Carter said quickly. And you, Mr. Reyes, have a history. Your record shows violent altercations. He let the room vote with silence. Why would a rational court allow a man with that background so much proximity to minors? The question snaked toward an answer Elena feared. What constituted a risk? A mugshot could be a biography. A patch could be a red flag. But how did you measure the distance between a man's past fights and his current tenderness? Elena thought of the battered dolls on her niece's grave and of nights she had spent keeping a child awake until the law took too long. Sometimes, she reflected, the law's reach felt like a slow limb. Marco's voice was soft in the way a blade can be. I've hurt people, I know that. But I've also kept kids from being taken to places they can't handle. I ride with men who've done wrong, yeah, but we keep our own. And when someone's in danger, we don't leave them. Murmurs picked up like wind. On the back benches, a man wearing the colors of a rival club shifted and smiled. Someone in the press made a motion with a camera. Elena felt the courthouse like a small island under a storm. Mrs. Santos, she asked, aiming for the center, have you been offered shelter? Have you been given a safe plan? Mia's eyes were hollowing with fatigue. The shelter told me beds were full. The precinct, she swallowed hard. They searched our place and told me to talk it out because it wasn't always violent. I didn't have money for a room. I had bills. I had no one. Why didn't you leave earlier? Carter pressed, softer now, the prosecutorial machine buying public sympathy. Because leaving costs more than money, Mia said, the words falling like coins. It costs you a job, a lifetime of papers. You try to get help with nothing, and they tell you it's your fault. I left in the night because staying meant the kids would see it. Her hands shook. I wasn't brave. I was exhausted. An ache tightened Elena's jaw. She had heard this before. The courthouse had a way of hearing only syllables, not the hunger behind them. She thought of laws that were written by hands that had never folded laundry while fear hummed beneath the fabric. She thought of the moral weight of making a ruling that would be written into family files and future decisions. Mr. Reyes, she went on, if the court orders protective custody for these children, can you guarantee they will be safe from anyone affiliated with you or your chapter? Marco's face was a map of lines, of highways and choices. He looked at the children, who were now sitting on a bench with a marshal between them, and something private moved in him. I can't make promises I can't keep. I can tell you this. I'm part of people who do anything to kids safe. If staying here means they go somewhere cold or worse, I'd rather the courthouse know I'm standing outside. There it was. His naked choice aligned against the system. Elena felt the room tilt. A judge's job was to make the best decision with available facts. But facts didn't always speak to the urgency of small bodies clinging to rough men. She remembered the long-ago night when she had begged for protection for a child and gotten processed forms instead. The memory warmed into something like purpose. "Order," she said, too quietly for the cameras. "We will do this. Temporary custody will be placed with the county's child services. They will arrange placement. Mr. Reyes, you will be notified of any placement, and if you wish, you may petition for supervised visits provided they are court-approved. You will not be allowed physical contact until the court issues an order." Carter smiled like a man who believes he's won. Marco's jaw hardened, but he nodded, the curvature of his neck like a muscle drawn taut. Outside, the men in rival colors exchanged looks that tasted like opportunity. The words on the paper had been scrunched toward a middle ground, protocols kept in place, the club's reach acknowledged but cordoned off, but Elena felt like she had awarded protection to a system that moved too slow. She had given the children to the very institution that had failed so many. She had given them to forms and waiting lists instead of a man who smelled of diesel and kindness. As the hearing recessed for the day, the courthouse emptied like a wound closing. Elena sat for a long time at her bench, hands folded, wondering whether she had done the right thing. The decision was legal, it was defensible, it was also brittle. A call came to her chambers, soft, clandestine. Her clerk's face carried a line she had learned to read: trouble. "Your Honor," the clerk said, "we have a message. A man at a diner asked whether the kids are staying in the city. He left his card. It has a patch on it." Elena's pulse did a small, sharp thing. On her desk lay the photograph of her niece, one she kept to remind herself why she had chosen this bench. Now a card had arrived, a ripple into her ordered life from the club's world she had sought to tame. "I'll be in touch," she told her clerk, but when the door closed, her hands found the photograph and turned it over, as if it might tell her what came next. Her choice had bought time and paper safety. What it hadn't bought was the quiet that a pair of children needed. Outside the courthouse, Marco kept to his promise. He sat on his bike like a sentinel, rain having already started to smear the city's edges. He watched as the marshal's van carried the kids into a world of intake forms and fluorescent lights. He could have followed. The marshal had told him he couldn't. He had been told he would be summoned if there was need. So Marco did what he knew. He rode, slow and low, until his bike's taillight blurred the city into a streak of red. At the Crescent's clubhouse, the morning's events simmered into a quiet storm. The brothers circled, protective instinct braided with annoyance and some pride. The president of an upstate club, a man named Hector who had older scars and a quieter voice, approached Marco with the smell of diesel and rain on him. "You did right by them?" Hector asked, an old man's voice wrapped in leather. Marco shrugged. "I did what I could." "You could have broken the order," a prospect muttered. Loyalty and rebellion mingled. "You could have gone in." "Then they'd have cuffed me and sent the kids to some place with fluorescent lights and no shadows for them to hide under," Marco said. His voice was flat, the sound of someone who had given up a ledger of the possible long ago. Sometimes the safe thing isn't the neat thing. Hector's eyes found the patch on Marco's jacket. The judge gave them to the system. "And what?" Marco's retort was a low groan. "You want a war in the street because bureaucracy failed a mother?" "They will taint us as saviors when it's convenient, and monsters when it suits them," another brother said. The words stung because they were true. The Iron Crescent had long been a paradox. A band of outlaws who were also the only people some folks could trust in a world that paid lip service to help and left the hungry with paper trails. For every life they saved, the media painted two sins. For every child they protected, the law drew a line they could not cross. Mia sat in the diner with her hands wrapped around a hot cup she hadn't earned but had been given by Marco. The warmth soaked into her palms like a small mercy. She had watched the van drive off and felt more exhausted than when they'd arrived. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked, voice tiny. "They will," Marco said, and the certainty in his words was not arrogance. It was the way a man would tell a child a story to calm a storm. "This system moves slow. If something feels wrong, I will be on it." "You're not supposed to be the one the kids run to," Mia said, the truth tasting like ash. "You're not supposed to be a mother with no options either," he answered. None of this was supposed to be clean. Their silence slid into something soft and dangerous. There was a history between them, though not the kind that law papers captured. He had, on countless nights, slid change into the pocket of her apron and told her jokes to make the kids laugh. She had, in turn, given him a small dignity, a cinnamon roll held between two fingers on the cheap vinyl of an afternoon. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Look after people like us." He looked at her as if she had opened a door no one else got to. "Because someone looked out for me once," he said. "And because when you see someone small and scared, you either walk away or you don't." Mia swallowed, the edges of her face raw with gratitude and shame. "You could get yourself into trouble." He shrugged, a small, honest movement. "Maybe. But trouble is better than letting kids grow up thinking adults are always the ones to be feared." The pull between them was an old current. It ran against the rock of their differences. Law and outlaw, apron and leather, the smell of coffee and the scent of gasoline. But beneath it was a shared hunger, to keep small lives safe, to make a place where kids could laugh without counting breaths. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a small human contract. "Don't do anything stupid," she said, half a command and half a plea. He met her eyes then, and there was a softness that surprised them both. "Not stupid," he said, "just necessary." The first hours after the hearing were a tangle of small decisions and big risks. Aleida reviewed the docket again and again, as if in repetition she might find a clause she had missed. She made a note to call child services, not to command, but to listen. She thought of the woman in the precinct 2 months back, who had left with a bruise and a sarcastic pamphlet. What responsibility did she have, beyond ruling on the present? The law was a river. The judge could influence its flow, not its source. Meanwhile, beyond the city, rival clubs stirred. A rumor is a kind of fever. Once it starts, it makes men act like predators smelling weakness. The Crescent's visibility made them vulnerable, and in the club rooms, maps and names were exchanged. The idea that the Crescent had interfered with the city's legal mechanisms added fuel to smoldering rivalries. That night, as rain turned to a hard, threatening rhythm, someone in a rival club decided they could use the courthouse's decision as leverage. They would remind the Crescent that every act of protection had a price. Night had a way of bringing the true colors of people out. For Marco, it brought a knot of worry that would not untie. For Mia, it brought the deep, weary knowledge that safety was rarely free. For Elena, it brought the heavy, insufficient truth that her ruling had been a bridge, but it might not be enough to protect what crossed it. And for the children, night would be a new lesson in the shape of adults, who kept promises, who made mistakes, who learned that law and love were sometimes at odds. The push and pull tightened like a rope around the city's shoulders. Decisions would have to be made that were not in law books. Who to trust, how to protect, what sacrifices to offer. The next moves would not be contained to the courthouse's sealed rooms. They would spill into alleys and highways, into the clubhouse and the diner, and the small beating hearts of 2 children whose laughter had cut through the silence and told everyone, painfully, that safety sometimes smelled like gasoline and coffee. The first blow came as a whisper, and then a thunderclap. A photograph on a rival club's social feed, grainy and vicious, captioned to imply theft, Crescent kidnap. In it, a surveillance still from a grocery store camera showed the van that had taken the children from the courthouse drive. The two small faces were blurred, but the angle, the timestamp, the license plate matched the county vehicle. The caption twisted truth like a knife. It suggested a plot in which the Iron Crescent had staged a daring heist to reclaim what the law had tried to claim. Marco saw the picture on his phone between the diner's counter and the club's back room, and for a second the world narrowed to a single line of panic. His brothers watched him look at the screen the way men watch lightning strike a place they love. Inside the clubhouse, a hush made of diesel and old songs fell. Hector pinched his fingers against his forehead until the knot in his scalp showed like a bruise. "That's not our van," Marco said, but there was a tremor in his voice that even his brothers could hear. "We didn't touch it." Hector's eyes searched his face. "Someone will say you did. The other club will make it look like provocation. They'll want to start a war." Marco's hands curled into fists. The children were out there somewhere, and the courthouse, her chambers, her gavel, had let them go into fluorescent hands. Who else knew they'd be taken? He demanded. The question opened a wound of suspicion inside the Emerald Room. Who had seen the timetable? Who had access to the courthouse drive? Information had the ability to become a weapon. Mia read the feed from the end of a booth in the diner, face pale under the neon sign. She wanted to tell him then, to lay everything bare. Her secret sat inside her like a stone. When she'd fled, there had been no one else. She had not only sought the Crescent because shelters were full. She had gone to them because she had borrowed, stolen money from her ex's stash. He had been a dangerous man with ties she couldn't explain to a rival club, and she had taken a handful of his cash in the dark, thinking survival justified the theft. She'd intended to pay him back. She hadn't known then that he could trace the missing money to her, that his anger would bloom into a plan, paint the Crescent as kidnappers, make the law come to them, use the children as leverage. She had been trying to keep them safe. She had created the trail that led to them. "Marco," she whispered when he sat at her table, the room narrowing to the space between their forearms. "There are photos. My ex, he's put something out." He turned to her then, and the look he gave was a kind of pleading. "Did you tell anyone where they were, Mia? Anyone at all?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to lie and make the world simple. But the truth tasted like metal in her mouth. "When I left, I took some money. I left a note. I thought—" Her words came in pieces, like things she had not let herself say aloud. "I didn't know he'd find them. I didn't mean." The thing that broke between them was not one of violence, but of trust. The brittle, vital trust that had been the thin bridge in which they'd met. Marco's jaw clenched until his knuckles went white. For years he'd acted on instinct. Children needed jackets, mothers needed rides, small people needed an adult who smelled dangerous enough to scare the things that preyed on them. He had not expected complicity. He had not expected that his hands, calloused and honest, would be bound by the secrets of the woman he had come to tend. "You put them at risk," he said finally, voice flat and exhausted. "You should have told me." Mia stared. "I was ashamed. I thought I could fix it before it dragged them in." "Fix it how, Mia?" he snapped. "By leaving breadcrumbs back to their father?" She flinched. The diner hummed around them, and her cheeks blazed. "I thought if I disappeared, they'd be safe. I thought if I could earn it back, get more shifts, hide the receipts." Marco's chest rose and fell like a bellows. He wanted to soothe her, to take it on, to make things right. Instead he stood, the movement a quiet thunder. "You didn't think, Mia. You panicked, and then you—" He stopped, because the next words would have been verdict. The room felt like a courtroom again, only now the defendant was a tired, real woman who had tried to buy safety with theft and secrecy. She watched his silhouette like a child watches a father leave the porch, and for a moment something irretrievable slid away between them. Loyalty was his marrow. Deception cracked that marrow open. He walked out without looking back. The fracture was not only between them. Inside the Iron Crescent, suspicions bloomed into accusations. A prospect who had once been a friend now said Marco had gotten too soft, that his softness endangered their code. Others whispered about the judge's concessions, keeping the Crescent's reach at arm's length while giving child services the authority to place the kids. To some, Elena's decision had been a capitulation. To others, it was a political play. Word reached the Crescent that morning that the rival club, the Black Halberds, had scheduled a meeting in an abandoned warehouse by the docks. It wasn't a coincidence. No meeting ever was. They wanted to discuss the courthouse incident, to strategize chaos in a way that would make the Crescent look like the guilty party and make the city authorities look incompetent. A man from the Halberds had family connections that wound through Mia's ex-life. Together, their plan smoothed into a dangerous seam. Elena sat at her desk, the courthouse light cold and indifferent. The photograph had been all over the morning feeds. The county's social pages courted outrage. Her clerk's call had turned into a handoff to higher-ups. And somewhere between the Department for Child Services and the county sheriff, a shuttle of emails and worried voices suggested that a scandal could bloom into violence. Elena's professional calm had been a scaffolding she now found too narrow for the storm. She made a call, one she hesitated over because it blurred professional boundaries she had always kept clean. The man who answered had an old softness in his voice. "Judge," he said, "we can help." The man was Miguel Alvarez, an old friend from law school who had, once, when they were younger and braver, tended to a different kind of bruised knife. He had become the deputy in charge of child welfare interventions. His presence was a balm, but also a risky entanglement. Involvement from law enforcement would place the kids into an official orbit away from the Crescent, but it would also escalate the media storm that could attract violent eyes. "Keep them safe," Elena said, and the words were heavy with a personal history she would not speak aloud. "Whatever you do, make sure they don't become bargaining chips." Miguel's voice was steady. "Well-set protection. We'll do discreet placement. But Judge, be careful. This can scorch the Crescent more than they can withstand." Elena felt the predicament like a splinter under her skin. She had half a mind to pull the splinter out and then realized no tool she had would do it cleanly. Every choice carried a wound. That night, the Halberds made their move. They sent a message to the Crescent. A shredded child's sweater hung from a highway overpass like a mockery of parenthood. It was a public provocation, meant to bait the Crescent into a response that could be answered with police force and public furor. The Crescent's younger members roared at the insult, the club's appetite for retribution immediate and dangerous. Hector spoke quietly to them, the authority of a man who had survived more winters than the ones that sat restless in their blood. "We don't play into their hands," he said. "We protect who we can without giving them the war they want." Marco had been restless all day, tracking leads with a graceless, stubborn energy. He'd gone to the stores near Mia's old apartment. He'd followed the plate number until it dissolved into a dead end. He'd argued with detectives who wore indifference like armor. Now he stood in the back room with the Crescent, while the sweater swayed in his mind like a child's ghost. The club's loyalty rose and pressed against him. Protect them, avenge, retaliate. His brothers wanted to storm the docks. His conscience wanted other things. Loyalty, he knew, could be a demand as harsh as any law. Mia, for her part, sat alone in the dark of a tiny back room at the diner, a schedule sheet in front of her with shifts inked like promises. She replayed the morning's choices like a record too scratched to get past. She had meant to protect her children. Instead, she had flung them into a public drama with rival men who tasted revenge like a feast. She had to live with that. She burned the receipt of the money she had taken. It was small and futile, but it was something she could control. Control, she realized, had been the thing she'd been trying to buy with stolen notes and borrowed kindness. Elena found herself walking the courthouse steps as dusk bled into rain. She wanted to swallow the whole city into one decision and hold it until it was soft enough to mend. Instead, she found herself at her car, staring at her hands like they might betray the past. The photograph of her niece sat in her pocket. She touched it like a talisman. The law had offered her tools, detention orders, placements, warnings, but none of them felt like enough for two small people who had chosen a man with inked knuckles over a system purported to protect them. A call came in them, from Miguel. "Judge," he said, breath low, "we have an informant. He says the Halberts plan to make a show. They want to take the kids to a meeting, to leverage public opinion and paint the Crescent as thieves. If they succeed, the city will call for charges. If they fail, they will go after the Crescent in the street." Elena closed her eyes. A map of consequences unrolled in her mind. Scenes on the evening news, kids interviewed in fluorescent rooms, the Crescent forced to defend themselves, publicly and maybe violently. The law could cancel narratives with indictments and arrests, but it could not cancel children's terror. She thought of making a decision that would keep kids away from both the Crescent and the Halberts. She also thought, with a warmth and a terror that had nothing to do with reason, of Marco leaning on his bike, watching like a man who would sprint into hell to keep two faces small and warm. "Contain the Halberds' movement," she said to Miguel. "Disrupt the meeting. Make the city a place they can't use as a stage." "And the Crescent?" he asked. "Keep them informed," Elena said, and the words tasted like compromise. "We must avoid a war." The next few hours were a blur of cars, of radios, of men in plain clothes moving through rain. The Halberds' warehouse was swept. They had planned for spectacle, but secrecy is a brittle thing in a city. Marco had been inside the clubhouse when law enforcement knocked at the door, not as a target, but as a witness. He could have refused cooperation, as the Crescent prided itself on silence, but he walked to the line between his brother's code and the children's faces and chose the children. He gave what he knew: license plates, times, the detail that Mia had once been seen near the docks with a man who fit the Halberds' description. Betrayal came then in a dozen forms. To some brothers it was treachery that he had spoken to the law. To others, it was the only thing that might keep the two small lives out of a public spectacle that would end badly. Mia, when she heard he'd cooperated, felt something like relief and shame fold together. Elena, watching the law she commanded move like a slow animal, felt gratitude and dread braided. When the Halberds were arrested, the city exhaled with a sound like paper unwrinkling. The Crescent's name was still in the papers, smeared, questioned, but the immediate danger had been blunted. The children were found, safe in a motel room used by the Halberds as a staging ground, tired and frightened, but alive. They ran to their mother when the knock on the motel, police, blotchy in the harsh light, announced rescue. They did not run to Marco first. They ran to their mother, pressed their small faces to her apron and to her shaken chest, and somewhere in their smallness felt the relief of being returned. Marco watched from the street, hands in his jacket, rain soaking the leather. The cleanse of rescue did not wash the hurt out. His cooperation had been an act of loyalty to a different kind of code, one that protected children over silence. The Crescent's men watched him through the rain, and some smiled with respect, while others watched with the calculating eyes of men who measure who is turned to the inside and who to the outside. Elena signed the temporary protective orders that night with a hand that trembled. She had ordered the children into the government's care because she believed, painfully and imperfectly, that separation from chaotic adults for a little while was a lifeline. But she had also quietly summoned Miguel to consider an alternative route, reunification with supervised provisions if and only if a plan that kept the children's mental and physical safety at the center could be ensured. It was a private rebellion against the forms. It was a wager on mercy. Marco walked away into the rain that night with his chest like a coal, hot and burning slow. He had done what he thought necessary. He had handed information to men in badges. He had given up the Crescent's beloved silence. He had ached to be where the children were when they were found, but instead had watched them brought to the fluorescent lights of official care. He felt the fracture between himself and the club. Some fissures would be repairable. Others might crack into permanent lines. Mia sat on a motel stoop, the two kids asleep in an officer's car under a blanket. She had watched them curl into themselves like rivers seeking beds. Guilt and gratitude warred inside her. She wanted to tell Marco everything, to confess the money, the thinking, the shame. But she also feared what the confession might take, his belonging, his brotherhood, his tender guardianship. She had already lost his trust that afternoon. Confession now might be a final fracture. When dawn came, Elena stood at an overpass overlooking the city. The courthouse behind her felt smaller somehow, a machine that could only do so much. Her phone had a message from Marco, a line, simple and raw. "If there's a way to make it right, tell me how." She answered with a truth she hadn't said aloud in years. "Protect them," she wrote. "Find a way that doesn't make victims of the brave." It was not a legal document. It was an order from one adult to another. Not a judge to a biker, but a human to a human. The fractures of the day had widened. Revelations had burned old clothes of trust into ash. But in the cracks, new things grew. Accountability, guilt, the first trembling shoots of repair. The question no longer was only of power or of right. It had become blunt and irrevocable. Who would stand between the city's hungry agencies and the night's predators, and at what cost? The city woke to rain-slick streets and headlines about arrests. The Iron Crescent's clubhouse smelled of coffee and the sharp aftertaste of choices. The Halberds were in the county lockup. Mouths swore they had been pushed out by a judge's order. The children were safe, but safety was only a season, not a forever. In the small rooms behind big decisions, people held their hands out like offerings. And the ache of fractures, between Mia and Marco, between the Crescent and the law, between Elena and the tidy rulings she had trusted, hung in the air like the abuse of a chord whose notes had not yet found concord. Secrets had broken the moments into shards. The work to gather them back into something that could be held without bleeding had only begun. Marco found her before she left the motel lot, standing under a sputtering street lamp like a figure waiting to be judged. The rain had thinned to a stubborn mist that climbed the collar of his jacket and settled as a fine, faithful sorrow on his shoulders. He'd heard the quiet that came after arrests, a tense hush that meant only the immediate threat had been ended, not the hunger that produced it. He had also heard, through the clubroom grapevine and the thin channels the law tolerated, that a handful of Halberd diehards refused to accept defeat. They wanted a spectacle small and vicious enough to sting the Crescent where it hurt, the people they kept. Mia looked at him as if assessing damage. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. Motherhood had given her a new kind of armor that did not shine but held. "Why did you tell them?" she started, the accusation soft and broken. "Because silence would have made them trophies," he said, voice blunt with sleeplessness. "Because I couldn't watch them used to start a war. Because I don't want kids afraid of every man who comes through their door." He stepped closer, the smell of oil and rain wrapped around him. "And because you put us in the bloody middle," he added, the hurt sharp but honest. Guilt cracked her. "I know," she whispered. "I know. I was selfish, scared. I thought I could fix it before it broke everything." Her hand trembled when she reached for his sleeve. It was a small, seeking thing. "I'm sorry." He let the apology be a salve. The Crescent's brotherhood had rules about betrayal. His own code had room for mercy. He cupped her fingers in his scarred palm, an oddly domestic motion for the man who lived in wind and road. "Don't do anything without telling me," he said, not a demand, but a promise. "I'll come. We'll do it together." They planned like conspirators in low light. Elena had arranged for supervised, trauma-informed reunification if Mia completed immediate safety and stabilization steps. Miguel promised discreet placement if the plan failed. But pledges on paper were fragile. Real safety required bodies in the right places at the right times. When the Halberd remnant tried one last gambit, a small team slipping into the motel's shadow to take advantage of understaffed security, Marco was already on his bike, a silhouette carved by headlight. He'd not told Mia. He couldn't ask her to bear that risk. Still, when the headlights flared and men moved like hungry shapes, the line between club code and fatherly instinct blurred. The first confrontation was ugly and brief. Marco's voice a command that carried club years. The Halberds' reaction a sputter of bravado. Metal clanged. A scuffle birthed curses. Marco took a blow to the ribs meant to undo breath. A second came for the face. He tasted blood and thought of the children's small mouths on his jacket. He kept moving, putting his body between a small man in a Halberd's colors and the motel's door. He did not flinch when a bottle cracked across his shoulder. He simply held the line. Someone from the Crescent, a prospect who owed Marco more loyalty than his own life, arrived like thunder, and together they shoved the attackers back into the parking lot where lights and cameras and officers finally corralled the violence. EMTs came. Marco let them patch him up, the pain singing in a long red thread across his ribs. The injury was nothing compared to the bruise in his chest when he saw Mia running into the street, children pressed to her like preachers to a hymn book. She moved to him then without thinking, hands assessing, fingers probing the wound with a fierce, immediate tenderness. "You idiot," she breathed. "You could have died." "I'd die 1,000 times before I'd let them be taken again," he said simply. The truth in it was a thing that had nothing to do with his patch and everything to do with the small, stubborn human inside his jacket. Elena arrived shortly after, not in robes, but with the quiet authority that had made her a judge who sometimes ruled with mercy and sometimes with sternness. She watched the scene through a legalist's and a human's split gaze. A biker bleeding for children he'd adopted into his chaos. A mother who had broken and was trying to be whole. She folded both into a plan that was less about punishment and more about reparation. That night, after bandages and statements and the settling ring of tired relief, Mia sat close enough to Marco that their knees brushed. Rain had soaked his jacket. Blood had dried into a map along his side. He winced when she adjusted the bandage. And she scolded him gently, the sound like an oath. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I didn't have a choice," he replied. "You and those two are my responsibility now, not by law, but by what I am." She leaned into him, shoulder against the curve of his chest. The Crescent's colors were a thunderous thing to the world, but here, in the shallow glow of a motel light, kindness looked like the residue of a man's life. He had given up silence, broken his club's code in favor of child safety, and risked a beating to keep them from being bargaining chips. That surrender was his confession and his claim. "Stay," she murmured, voice fragile but urgent. "Stay with us. Not at the clubhouse, not in the margins. Stay." Marco's laugh was small, incredulous as prayer. "You want me to live inside a life that's half coffee stains and half courtrooms? I want you to live where the kids can see you," she said, "where they can know an adult who keeps his promises." He looked at the two sleeping shapes in the back seat of the cruiser where they'd been allowed one last warm moment before official transport, surrendered but protected, and felt the planet shift. Love, he understood now, was not an adornment. It was a sacrifice measured in ordinary, stubborn acts. To stay would mean choosing a smaller kind of war, the one against bureaucracy, prejudice, and the long habits of his own brothers. It would mean risking the Crescent's ire and making a life that would require him to be more exposed than he ever had. He chose. "I'll stay," he said, and the words landed between them like a treaty. "I'll do what the judge and Miguel want. I'll work. I'll take shifts at the diner. If it means I can be where they are and not in a courtroom, then I'll take it." Mia's hand tightened. "You'll lose a lot of brothers." "I'll lose what I have."